Conclusion Part 4, Togliatti, Stalin and the Cold War. We are now able to understand the attitude taken by Togliatti after the outbreak of the Cold War. Possibly the most uncomfortable year for him was 1952. It was the year in which two statements by Stalin were emitted that were difficult to reconcile with one another. Briefly speaking, at the 19th Congress of the CPSU, and denouncing the subaltern status of Washington's European and Western allies and vassals, the Soviet leader called on the Communist parties to take up the banner of national independence and democratic freedom thrown out to sea by their country's bourgeoisie. Still during the year before his death, Stalin expressed himself in substantially different terms in writing Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. Rather than resign themselves to the undisputed hegemony exercised by the United States, the other capitalist powers would have to challenge it. More acute than the very contradiction between capitalism and socialism, the inter-imperialist contradiction would sooner or later provoke a new world war, as had happened in 1914 and 1939. And all this confirms the inevitability of war within capitalism. As is well known, things have gone in the completely opposite direction with respect to the prediction made in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. It hasn't been the imperialist camp that has unraveled, but rather the socialist one. The more acute threats of a world war occurred not as a result of the competition for hegemony between the great capitalist powers, but as a result of the intention by the United States to contain socialism and the anti-colonial revolution and to reverse it. Think of the crisis of 1962, which not by chance saw its epicenter in Cuba. The control exercised by Washington over its allies and vassals has not disappeared, instead it has since been consolidated, as has been demonstrated by the inglorious end to the Anglo-French adventure of 1956 in Suez and the decline of the Gaullist challenge in France. The logical mistake contained in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR is evident. The premise of the inevitability of war and capitalism doesn't in any way lead to the conclusion that the conflict between imperialist powers is always the order of the day, almost as if that conflict never contained, or contained only for a brief time, distinctions between winners and losers. For example, after the defeat of what Lenin defines as Napoleonic imperialism, for almost a century British imperialism had practically no rivals. And this is all the more true for the United States, which hasn't had any serious rivals in the imperialist camp after the end of World War II, that had witnessed the defeat of Germany, Japan, and Italy, but also the wounding and serious decline of Great Britain and France. The fact remains that Stalin in 1952 outlined two contradictory scenarios. The first, looking to Europe at the time, he denounced the bourgeoisie for their capitulation toward the policies of war and oppression carried out by Washington. Looking particularly toward the future, the second scenario denounced the intrinsically warmongering nature of the various bourgeois ruling classes, all put on the same level. In his report to the Central Committee of the PCI on November 10, 1952, Togliatti warned against taking the wrong conclusions from the thesis of the inevitability of war and against losing sight of the concrete and immediate task of the struggle to keep the peace, at that time threatened by the aggressive policies put into action by the United States against the socialist camp and the anti-colonial revolution. It's for this reason that the Italian communist leader primarily and almost exclusively referenced the other speech by Stalin, the one that invited communists to defend their national independence and political democracy itself, put at risk by the McCarthyite wave that threatened to cross the Atlantic and establish itself in Italy and Western Europe as well. In truth, Togliatti had started elaborating this line before Stalin's speech to the 19th Congress of the CPSU. In his report to the 7th Congress of the PCI, held between April 3 and April 8 in 1951, he denounced United States imperialism, determined to disturb every effort toward the development and transformation of Italian democracy, and he demanded a program of Italian independence, the independence of our country from anyone who seeks to subject our economic and political life to their interests or those of foreign imperialism. There's a lot that suggests it had been Togliatti influencing Stalin, who had from the platform of the 19th Congress invited Western communists to take up the banner of democracy and national independence abandoned by the bourgeoisie. Certainly, in his subsequent report to the Central Committee of the PCI on November 10, 1952, Togliatti was much more forceful, pointing the finger at the reactionaries in our region, against the Italian and European reactionaries. Quote, "Comrade Stalin has ripped off their masks, he has revealed how they had thrown out to sea all that which in the past had constituted the political action by democratic and liberal bourgeois groups. They had thrown out to sea the banner of freedom and independence for the people, therefore it's left to us to pick up that banner and carry it forward, to become the patriots of our country and thereby become the nation's leadership force." Unquote. In light of the considerations already made, one could say that, in citing Stalin, Togliatti was primarily citing himself. The line that emerged was clear, yet nothing new. It was necessary to first fight against those that sought to strangle freedom and sell the country's independence, who were prepared to accept the transformation of Italy into a colony subservient to foreign imperialism. It was necessary to strike at and neutralize the leadership of countries dominated by the United States of America. The objective pursued by the latter was defined as follows, quote, "To achieve dominion over the whole world, the economic, political and military subjugation of a whole series of countries that until yesterday were independent countries, and even developed capitalist countries like France and Italy, the preparations for an attack on the Soviet Union, China, and the popular democracies. To be specific, in the preparation of the forces necessary for this attack and to complete its objectives, American imperialism has organized military bases all over the world. It sends its own troops and stations them in countries that until yesterday were independent, and who would have never tolerated their occupation by foreign troops." Unquote. It would be a serious mistake to read this passage as a banal, propagandistic tirade. Instead, before us is a theoretical and political reflection. What defines imperialism is not just its hostility toward the socialist bloc and the anti-colonial revolution, especially because what also characterizes it is the struggle for hegemony. Imperialism can include the subjugation, whether colonial or semi-colonial, of independent countries, and even those with developed capitalism like France and Italy, and therefore of a country like France that in 1952 had a large colonial empire in its possession. The contradiction between developed capitalist countries is not necessarily and exclusively an inter-imperialist contradiction. It can even be the contradiction between a particularly strong and aggressive imperialist power and a potential colony or semi-colony. It would give it too much credit to think that imperialism would refrain from transforming a developed capitalist country into a colony or semi-colony. Togliatti was very familiar with Lenin's dispute with Kautsky. What defines imperialism is not just its drive to conquer agrarian lands, but to get its hands on heavily industrialized countries as well, especially because that can weaken its adversaries. On the basis of a precise historical and theoretical reading, with the aim of avoiding the danger of Italy being dragged by United States imperialism into a war against the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, Togliatti made a call for the broadest mobilization possible. The movement that Italy needs must be a movement of the great popular masses, from any party, from whatever social group they belong to, for the salvation of peace. Even the citizens who are furthest from us today can and should be drawn into this cause's work. And therefore it's up to us, the party of the working class, at this time, like during the gravest moments of the past, to recognize and defend the interests of the entire nation. Was that the abandonment of the class struggle? The response to this possible objection was already prepared. No, There's no contradiction between a national program and a class program by the Communist Party. Togliatti knew what is to be done too well to flatten the class struggle with a trade unionist reading, especially because in the Soviet Union he had been able to directly follow the epic resistance by Moscow, Leningrad and Stalingrad against the attempt by the Third Reich to revive and radicalize the colonial tradition in Eastern Europe, reducing the entire Soviet people to a state of slavery, in service to the so-called master race. Togliatti had understood very well that the Great Patriotic War was one of the greatest class struggles, not only in the 20th century, but in world history. It's worthwhile to note that in November of 1938, at a time when Japanese imperialism sought to impose a barbaric form of colonial rule and slavery on the Chinese people as a whole, Mao Zedong had theorized, in those circumstances, the connection between the national struggle and the class struggle. Like the Great Patriotic War, the war of resistance against Japanese imperialism should also be counted among the great class struggles, not only in the 20th century, but in world history. It's almost certain that Togliatti was unaware of the text from the Chinese Communist leader that was just cited. All the more significant is the fact that he reaches the very same conclusions by working from the concrete analysis of the concrete situation.